Now, Lancia began 112 years ago, and from the early 1900s all the way up until about 1960. Right. Let's try this one again. Lancia and Si Fabbrica Automobili was founded in 1906 by Vincenzo Lancia and Claudio Foglin with the Tipo 51, their first road car. They sold over 100 of them, thanks to their 28 horsepower inline-4, giving it a top speed of 56 miles an hour. Sure, it's a bit pedestrian nowadays, but this is 1906. That is amazing performance, and also kind of terrifying when you think about it, because there were no such thing as paved roads back then. So they were doing 56 on dirt. Now, in order to progress from the Tipo 51, Lancia, and yes, it is going to be Lancia, I know it's officially pronounced Lancia, however, I'm American, I see an I, it's Lancia. End of discussion. Lancia quickly decided that the best way to deal with their competition was innovation. So they fitted things like the first electrical system and the first adjustable steering column in their 1913 Theta. And their Arda introduced a 5-speed gearbox. Meanwhile, the Aurelia was the first production car with a V6, while the Belen Eclipse featured the first retractable hardtop, and the Aprilia had the first inboard brakes on a road car. That is an incredible amount of innovation for such a tiny company. And then there was the 1922 Lancia Lambda, arguably the most important car that you have never heard of. It introduced the first monocoque chassis, the first V4 engine, with the first aluminum engine block, and the first hydraulic shock absorbers, which was followed up with the first coil spring shock absorbers. This was an incredibly innovative car. And over 11,200 of them were sold in 9 years. Which, yeah, for 1922 wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. And that was Lancia's problem, in all honesty. They built some of the most technologically significant cars in history. End of discussion. But they also built them by hand. And not only was it expensive, it also took a long time to build. They couldn't actually build them fast enough. And they were losing money hand over fist. And with Vincenzo's death in 1937, the company was in even dire straits, which is why, by 1969, they were bought out by Fiat, who began pushing out new models. And some old ones, like this little thing called the Fulvia. The Fulvia came in a lot of different versions, notably 4-door sedans and the incredibly beautiful 2-door coupe. It was also strange for a coupe because it was front-wheel drive. And it was expensive for sure for what it was. It cost about the same as an E-Type Jag. However, it was brilliant to drive and incredibly fast for the era. 130 horsepower from its V4 engine propelled the little front-wheel drive coupe to 60 in 7.7 seconds. That's fast for a front-wheel drive car today. That's only 0.6 of a second slower than the Ford Fiesta ST. And critically, it was Lancia's first forte into rallying. You see, they tried doing some Formula 1 racing, which didn't work out too well. The car was okay, but it really took some tuning by Ferrari, because Lancia backed out of Formula 1 and sold their assets to Enzo Ferrari, who turned it into a world champion. But Lancia was a little skeptical about going into motorsport after their Formula 1 fiasco. But rallying seemed to fit them surprisingly nicely. They took the Italian Rally Championship 8 out of 9 times between 1965 and 1973. And the International Championship for Manufacturers was theirs in 1972, the last front-wheel drive car to win an International Rally Championship. Because technically the WRC didn't exist, that came out in 1973, but the Fulvia will go down in history as the last front-wheel drive car to win an International Rally Championship. And that wasn't it for their impressive vehicles. Sort of. You see, it was very much a yin-yang company, because there was the Gamma Coupe, which had a brilliant, powerful, yet smooth, flat-4 engine, which exploded if you looked at it wrong. Then there was the Monte Carlo, that was a mid-engine sports car making 120 horsepower, that won the FIA World Sports Car Championship twice in a row for Group 5 racing. That also had 0 brakes, because in order to stop the brakes from locking up, they removed the brake servo. Whoops. And then there was the Thema, which was a front-wheel drive executive sedan, so it was comfortable, compact-ish for a sedan. And it also happened to feature a Ferrari 3-liter V8 under the hood. That meant it could hit 60 in under 7 seconds. Although the engine was not really designed for a front-wheel drive front-engine layout, so the handling wasn't German rivaling as they would have hoped. But it could still hit 60 in under 7 seconds, and, for a little bit of trivia here, it was the first production car to have an active rear spoiler. Not a Porsche, not a McLaren, not a Ferrari. Lancia front-wheel drive sedan. There you go. So their cars were not perfect, they had many flaws, but they also were kind of brilliant and amazing, and you love them because they look so good, they sound so good, and they drive so well when they don't explode, catch on fire, rust away. But their bread and butter, the one that undisputably they could not be matched in, was rallying. Going back to the Fulvia, the front-wheel drive coupe did very well. They were already very successful. However, the Renault Alpine A110 showed that front-wheel drive's days were numbered. So in response to the rear-engined Alpine, they did the only logical thing. They built the first ever WRC homologation special, the Stratos. We already covered the Stratos in a video on its own. But for the TLDR, it had a Ferrari Dino V6, one of the last Dino V6s ever made, in fact. They mounted that in the middle of a purpose-built sports car chassis that weighed less than 2,500 pounds, and it was incredibly short wheelbase. So when you combine the nimble and agility of the short wheelbase mid-engine sports car with the Ferrari power, it was a weapon on the international rally stage, winning 3 titles in a row and the first ever driver's title in 1977. And despite politics from Fiat pulling Lancia out of rallying in 1977, handing the Stratos over to privateers, the Stratos continued to win rallies until 1981. And Lancia didn't want rear-wheel drive to die with the Stratos, so they actually teamed up with their old rivals at Abarth to make, in my opinion, the greatest rear-wheel drive rally car ever. The 037. It's kind of sort of ish based on a Monte Carlo road car, however, it was a space frame silhouette racer. Mid-engined, 310 horsepower, supercharged 4-cylinder, and after a titanic nail-biter finish between Audi and Lancia, the 037 became the last rear-wheel drive car to win the World Championship in 1983, and the only rear-wheel drive car to beat the all-wheel drive Audi Quattro. But sort of like the Fulvia to the Alpine, Lancia knew rear-wheel drive's days were over. So in 1985, with the Group B class being used to its fullest extent, Lancia decided to maximize the No Rules rulebook with the all-wheel drive Delta S4. It was made almost exclusively out of aluminum, Kevlar or fiberglass, which meant despite the all-wheel drive, it weighed less than 2,000 pounds. And it had a 1.8-liter turbocharged and supercharged engine, also a world first for Lancia in case you were wondering, but it's not the incredible innovative technology that was put into the engine that was the most impressive part, or the fact that it made 550 horsepower. It was the fact that it made 550 horsepower in a conservative state of tune, with 1,000 horsepower seen in extreme testing scenarios. The thing generated 75 psi of boost, and it launched the car to 60 in 2.3 seconds on dirt in 1985. For reference, the fastest road car ever tested to 60 right now is the Porsche 918 Hybrid at 2.1 seconds. Yeah. Henry Toivonen won on the car's debut at the end of 1985, and it was looking like an easy 1986 championship despite Peugeot's new 205 T16 Evolution 2. Sadly, Toivonen was killed in an accident that led to the entire Group B category being banned, and the title ended up going to Peugeot. Now, all of these manufacturers had been investing millions into purpose-built F1 cars for the Force, as the Group B cars were nicknamed, and then the series was cancelled. So, when you develop a purpose-built mid-engine rally car, and that suddenly has nowhere to race, you're kind of screwed. Well, except if you're Lancia, because Lancia was able to adapt the Delta from the S4 spec into the new Group A spec, and they called it the Integrale. The 2-liter turbo all-wheel drive hatchback made absolute mincemeat out of its competition. In 1987, the first year of Group A, it won 9 out of 13 rallies. The next year, they won the championship again, this time taking 10 out of 11 wins that season. You think Mercedes is dominant in Formula 1, you should have seen Lancia in the late 80s, early 90s. And even as Toyota with their Celica managed to put more pressure, Lancia just kept developing the Delta to match it. That's the thing about the Delta, it never really innovated anything, and it never did anything radical. It just took what was learned in Group B and scaled it down to meet Group A. The car as a platform was good enough to adapt for both series, so they had a massive head start on their competitors. And it wasn't just the rally cars that were fantastic. You see, you actually had to make homologation road cars for Group A rallying, which meant they made road cars of the Delta, and they called it the HF Integrale Evoluzione 2 in 1993. And it made 215 horsepower, weighed less than 3,000 pounds, and thanks to its all-wheel drive system, it was incredible to drive. It had a little bit of understeer. We're not going to give continuous praise here, even though it pretty much deserves it. But damn was it fast. It was one of the fastest hatchbacks in the world with a 0 to 60 of 5.7 seconds. And it's a Delta homologation bargain. These things only go for around $100,000, which compared to the Delta S4 road car homologation for Group B, which costs upwards of $1 million now, is a pretty good deal. And the constant evolution from the 8 valve to the 16 valve to the Evolution to the HF Evolution to the Evo 2 meant that the Integrale was incredibly successful. In its 6 years of factory-backed competition, it won 4 drivers' titles and 6 manufacturers' titles. That gives Lancia the most manufacturer titles in history, at 11, a record that cannot be beaten until at least 2025, and that is only if Citroën re-enters the WRC and wins 4 titles in a row. And it is also the only car in history to score 6 titles on the trot, and is tied with the WRX as the most successful rally car of all time in terms of wins, with 46 rallies won. It's one of my favorite cars of all time. It's by far the most successful of any racing series, short of maybe the McLaren MP4-4. And what was I say? It's one of the greatest road cars and greatest race cars of all time. Which is sad because it also marked the high watermark for Lancia as a company. As the 1990s rolled through, Lancia steadily declined. first leaving the US market and then the UK market shortly after that. The 2008 financial collapse reduced them to selling rebadged Chryslers under the Fiat branch. And by 2017, Lancia was selling just one car in one country. The Ypsilon is currently only available in Italy, and it's basically just a fancy Fiat 500. It makes 90 horsepower and is pretty comfy for a front-wheel drive hatchback. It's not special or noteworthy at all, and it's certainly not worthy of the Lancia badge, but it sells well. In fact, it was the second best-selling car in all of Italy in 2019. And I think that actually might be the relaunch point for Lancia, because now that FCA has merged with the PSA group and became Stellantis, these guys have bundled DS Automobiles, Alfa Romeo, and Lancia into the premium brand division, which means we might actually get new Lancias outside of Italy for the first time this century. And I'm not talking about no rebadged Chrysler.